Jai Hind, Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing The Hindu and Indian Express for the date 3rd of November 2020. Now, for your convenience, I have added timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip to a particular news, please use those timestamps. And free PDFs for selected topics from this video are available on the Telegram channel, the link to which is in the description. Also, if you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. And please give us a thumbs up if you like this video. So without wasting your time, let's get started. So starting with the Hindu, Supreme Court stays EC order revoking star campaigner status to Kamal Nath. So we have discussed what is a star campaigner. Each party, it decides its own star campaigner and they go for campaigning, right? And what is the advantage of being a star campaigner? That all the expenditure that is incurred during the campaigns of star campaigner are not added to the election expenditure of a candidate, right? The only caveat is that the star campaigner would not be campaigning specifically for a candidate, but the campaign would be general in nature. So because of some of his status, EC had revoked his star campaigner status. Now he filed a case in the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has told EC that you do not have any power to take away the star status. Now the relevant section is, if you remember, it was section 77B only, under which the people get the star campaigner status, section 77B of Representation of People's Act. So now the relevant part is section 77(1) of the Representation of the People Act, read with the guidelines for star campaigners issued by the Election Commission from time to time, makes selection and revocation, see both selection and revocation of star campaigners, the sole prerogative of political party. If you remember, I've also told you that there is no formal definition of a star campaigner, neither under the Representation of People's Act, right, or the ECI rules. So that is all about it. Then Attorney General declines consent for contempt case against Jagan. So this is a political case, nothing much for us to discuss per se within this, but let us look at the concept of Attorney General. So who's the Attorney General of India? He is the part of Union Executive and he is the highest law officer in the country. So Article 76 of the Constitution provides for the office of the Attorney General. So that means it is a constitutional body. Then appointment and qualification is appointed by the President on the advice of the government, the Union Council. Must be a person who is qualified to be appointed a judge of the Supreme Court. So at this point, we will also get to know what is the qualification for being the judge of a Supreme Court. Must be a citizen of India. Must have been a judge of some high court for 5 years or more, or an advocate of some high court for 10 years, or an eminent jurist in the opinion of the President. So these are the qualifications for being the judge of a Supreme Court, and same apply for any person to be appointed as Attorney General of India. Now talking about the term of office, that is how many years can that person be in office? It is not fixed by the Constitution. He serves the pleasure of the President. That means he can be removed at any time whenever the President feels like it, and he does not have to per se give any reason. Removal, procedures and grounds for the removal are not stated in the Constitution. So though it is a constitutional body, the procedures and grounds are not stated. Holds office during the pleasure of the President, I've already told you, may be removed from the President at any time. Now what are the duties and the functions? Please pay attention again. To give advice to the Government of India upon such legal matters which are referred to him or her by the President. Then perform other such duties of a legal character assigned by the President, and to appear on behalf of Government of India in all cases of the Supreme Court or in any case in any High Court in which Government of India is a party or is concerned. Now why did the Attorney General give the opinion in the present case? Because Government of India is concerned. Why? Because it was regarding the judge of a Supreme Court, right? Now appointments of the judge of a Supreme Court, though they are happening under the collegium system of the Supreme Court, but the sealing authority is the President of India, right? So that is why his opinion was sought. Also to represent the Government of India in any reference made by the President to the Supreme Court under Article 143. So this is known as the advisory power of the Supreme Court, that the President may seek advice on any issue from the Supreme Court, right? So if that is the case, again, Attorney General would be representing Government of India, and to discharge the functions conferred on him, her by the Constitution or any other law. So the functions provided by the President and the functions provided by Constitution or any other law. Now, what are the rights and limitations? Very, very interesting. Now, here, Article 88 is very important. So, has the right to speak and to take part in the proceedings of both the houses of the Parliament or their joint sitting. Joint sitting is provided under Article 108, and any committee of the Parliament of which she may be named a member but without a voting right. So he has all the privileges and immunities that are available to MPs while taking part in the proceedings of the Parliament, but does not have the right to vote as he is not a member of the Parliament. And these privileges are provided to him under Article 88. So one was Article 76, which provides for the office of Attorney General, and Article 88 is about his rights and immunities within Parliament. Now she does not fall in the category of government servants. That means can take part in private legal practices, provided he is not taking part in any such case in which Government of India is a party, or he cannot provide any counsel against the Government of India. That is the only limitation. Apart from that, he can present himself before any court in the country. So should not advise or hold a brief against Government of India. Now he has assistants in the form of Solicitor General of India and Additional Solicitor General of India to assist the Attorney General in the fulfillment of the official responsibilities. And the corresponding office at the state level is of the Advocate General under Article 165. Then to the editorial, Education, the Nation and the States. So this is by Mr. Krishna Kumar. He is the ex-chief of NCRT. Now he's made some points about the evolution of the education system, and his main theme is the role of states in the education system and how the new education policy has also avoided or neglected states' role vis-a-vis education. So let us see what he's saying. So first he tells us that the education policies so far have neglected provincial diversities. States have their own social world and they prefer to carry out their own systems. Now talking about the evolution, historically they evolved in the provinces, and unlike other federations, India has a central education ministry, and its function is not just to coordinate but also to articulate aims, standards, or to pave the way for nation building and development. So this is a peculiar fact about Indian Federation. He says that after independence, there was an emergence of specialized schools and professional institutions of the center which received higher funding. For example, central schools, they basically started to cater to the civil servants and the army officers, right? They got higher funding, and initially they were very prestigious school. Even today they are very good schools and they provide very good education at very cheap rates, right? And then there were national level resource institutions which guided policy and encouraged new practices. So he's saying that this concurrency, that is both center and states making laws or guiding the policy in the education realm, was present even before the actual amendment, the 42nd Amendment of 1976, which basically transferred education from a state subject to a concurrent subject. I've already told you that under Schedule 7, there are three types of subject: central or union, state, and concurrent. Now for union subjects, only the union government can make laws. For state subjects, only the state government can make laws. And for concurrent subjects, both the center and the state can make laws, right? But if there's a clash between central and state laws in the concurrent list, then generally it is the central law that prevails, right? Now he tells us that the education policy in 1986, which was a decade after this, emphasized on national concerns and perspective without specifically referring to the provincial practices that indicated strong divergence. And if you can see, and if you are from other boards apart from CBSE, you would be knowing that different states have different curriculum, right? And they have different methods and modes of approaching education. Then he says that post 1990s, under the LPG reforms, liberalization, privatization and globalization, people got more access to money and also more exposure. So there was demand for private education, especially by the middle class, and that led to the privatization of education. Now he says the education system as of now, what we have, it is a 3-tier system, or it has 3 parts: the central, the state and the private. Now the central system is running an exam board that has an all India reach through affiliations with English medium private schools catering to regional elite. So this is basically CBSE and ICSE. The central system also includes advanced professional institutes and universities that have access to greater per capita funding than what their counterparts run by states can afford. So for example, any central university or any central colleges, they get more funding, they have more prestige than states. Why? Because of funding only. Then he talks about the state system. So they are the state counterparts of the central system, that means state boards, and also features provincial secondary boards affiliating schools teaching in state languages. So they pay more attention to state languages. In the central system, you have a very standardized system of looking at the languages, right? But state system, they provide for accommodation to diversities, and that is something what is missing in the central system as per Mr. Krishna Kumar. Now talking of the private system, it is based purely on private investment. For example, the IB board, and there's also the Cambridge board, right? They're very costly schools. Internationally accredited school boards and globally connected private universities. These institutions represent a new level of freedom from state norms because they have high autonomy. Now he's also talking about the role of right to education. This was an explicit attempt to bridge the first two systems, that is the central and the state system, to bring some form of homogenization between the two, and also to set standards for elementary education and a call to private schools to provide for social justice via quota route. So if you know, 33% of seats in every class is reserved for children belonging to EWS category, that is economically weaker sections. Such efforts in higher education are still missing. Yes, it is true, but in higher education we have caste-based reservation system, right? Then he talks about coordination and inequalities. He says that the coordination among the three systems has proved unmanageable, central, state and private, and there are stark differences. For example, when you talk about NEET exam, when it was formed, then there was large scale resistance by the states because they said that there is a difference between CBSE curriculum and the state curriculum, and NEET system basically favors the CBSE system, especially southern states like Tamil Nadu. So he says that these inequalities with time have become sharper with the rise of overall prosperity. So now more and more people are going for private schools, and then number two, central schools, and third comes the state level education boards. And he's giving example of TN quota. Recently the horizontal quota that they provided, 7.5%, if you remember, we discussed within each category, two types of quota, vertical and horizontal. Now he's also talking about the problems as per his analysis with the new education policy. The new policy document underestimates the problem of reconciling the three systems. It favors functional equality, unlikely to offer any real solution. In the higher education, it proposes nationally codified and administered measures to oversee institutional transformation across state capitals and district towns. Again, national problem, right? But then if there is a nationally codified something, then at least it leads to homogenization, right? And that is very, very important. The idea of monolithic regulatory architecture to control a system that is privatizing at a rapid pace suggests a tempting impulse rather than a considered plan. Then talking about autonomy. So the policy gives autonomy in terms of finances, right? So he's saying that it cannot be interpreted in financial terms alone. They should also have autonomy as per the norms of curriculum and other norms that they want to implement. Now he says at the school level too, the new policy proposes a post-RTE structural shift, but ignoring the fact that RTE itself has not yet been fully implemented, and that is absolutely true. RTE was drafted with prolonged involvement with states, not mere consultation. So now this new education policy, he says, is lacking this prolonged involvement of states. It was based on just mere consultations. So that was the strength of RTE, and this is the weakness of NEP. So he says that RTE needs further financial support. Then only can we talk about post-RTE structural shift. So these are the important points from this editorial. Then this one, Sero surveys underestimate building of herd immunity. This is just to understand some concepts. Some parts are important, so we'll be discussing those only. Now first, it begins by telling us about the purpose of Sero survey. And what is Sero survey? It is to detect the prevalence of antibodies against COVID-19. Now the purpose is to measure the proportion of a population already infected as evidenced by antibody positivity. So what they do, they select a random sample, right? And then they conduct tests on them and they check for antibodies. Now antibodies are your body's basically immune response when it is exposed to any disease. So the presence of antibodies basically represents that you have been infected. So that is the whole principle behind this. Now when applied on a national scale, a random sample of entire population is tested, then the data are extrapolated to the whole population. Imagine it is not at all possible to test 1.3 billion people, right? So they select people randomly, right? Randomly, anyone. Now randomly in medical terms means that everybody has an equal probability of getting the infection, right? And they select people from different socio-economic, geographical and other backgrounds so that they have a representative sample, right? Representative sample means that it should be representing every region of India across the demographic structures, right? So in biostatistics, random means each individual has an equal probability of getting selected. Statisticians stratify the population and select a random sample. Again, stratify means what I told you, that different representatives of different sections of the population, so that the prevalence figures obtained is representative of the whole population. The result of a random sample sero survey can be confidently extrapolated to obtain the national level prevalence of antibodies. So this is about your sero survey, what they are and how they are conducted. Now the next point is what the antibody test says. Now antibodies are the footprints to the host's response of virus infection. I've already told you that presence of antibody in your body means that you have been infected and your body produced some immune response to fight that infection. Their presence in the blood serum confirms past infection. Now they say that their results can be surprising and they have to be interpreted with caution. So the virus carries several antigens both on the surface and internally. The body responds to all of them. So there are many antigens, right? Now for the purpose of testing, 4 antigens are selected, right, to detect the antibodies. These are spike protein S1 and S2, receptor binding domain RDB, and nucleocapsid N. So S1, S2, RBD and N, these are the antibodies that are checked. An antibody against each antigen, that is your immune response fighting it, has its own time of appearance, duration in blood and rate of decay over time, right? So like they are telling that there are multiple or several antigens. So there will be several antibodies in your body and each has a different time of appearance, duration for which it will be in your blood and rate of decay, that is the rate at which they will get out from your body or your system. However, detection of antibodies does not correlate well with the protective virus neutralizing function of the immunity. So they are saying that just because antibodies are there, it does not mean that your protective virus neutralizing immunity is active, because testing of virus neutralizing antibodies is not an option. Since handling the virus is risky for lab personnel, it is prohibited in clinical labs and restricted to selected research labs. Now they are talking about a recent publication in the Journal of American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine. Now some interesting facts, that people with asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infections, which is the majority in any country, these antibodies level decline over time, reaching 50% of initial levels by about 36 days and becoming undetectable by 60 days after proven infection. And in India, we have set a standard of 100 days for reinfection, right? Such asymptomatic and mildly symptomatic cases constitute more than 80% of those infected by the virus, and that is true for every country, right? Now they are saying that the available test kits, they test for only one antigen, but the problem is there are multiple antigens, right? And 4 have been selected for testing, and even out of those 4, only 1 is being tested by the available test kits. Now the ICMR conducted 2 sero surveys, and we've discussed those surveys, right? Their figures as well. But the problem they are saying is that sero survey 1 measured S1 antibody and the second survey used another antigen, rendering the inter-survey comparison problematic. Yes, that is true. Now the sero survey prevalence was 0.73. Now they are making their own figures, extrapolating. So let's not get into it. Then they're talking about the cautious interpretation. They say that if taken at face value, Sero survey results grossly underestimate true prevalence, which is again true because we have seen the inherent flaws in Sero surveys, except in very few early phases of epidemic when infected people 2 months earlier were very few. So this is also true that in the initial phase, they can be helpful, but later on it would be a problem. Misinterpreting Sero survey results has serious consequences for understanding the epidemic profile. Again true. The predicted herd immunity levels, I've already told you herd immunity means that 70% or 80% people have been infected and they have developed antibodies in their bodies, right? Level needed to end the epidemic was 60% for normal epidemic curve with a peak at its halfway mark. So see, this curve would look something like this, like a bell, that this is a peak, and then both in the initial phase and the waning phase, the numbers are equal, right? This is the bell curve for your epidemic. For a normal epidemic curve, the cumulative number of people infected before the peak will be equal to the number of those who will be infected after the peak, because the curve is bell shaped. Again, see this bell shaped. It won't be linear, of course. So it will be a curvilinear, and this is your peak. This is before peak, after peak. So this is all that you need to know from this one. Then this one, back to school, nothing for me to discuss. They are basically talking about reopening of schools and how globally the experience of reopening schools has elicited a mixed response. And government have deferred to learning needs in Europe, where lockdowns have been reimposed due to fresh wave of cases. In any case, data published in August show that children represented less than 5% of all infections in 27 European countries. Teachers' unions in Britain are calling for limited classes to help disadvantaged children and those with parental commitments. Public schools in many US states remain closed, while some private institutions have reopened. France is asking even small children to wear masks along with the teachers. The consensus is to prevent crowding, mandate masks, and allow natural air to ventilate the room. Such precautions have universal applicability as preventive measures. So this is all that is the experience till now of opening the schools. Now India is also trying to, so Andhra Pradesh and Assam are opening from November 2. Central government has said till the end of November. So let us see, let us hope that this virus does not mutate in the winter, because then it will be a problem. As of now, children are least affected. Thankfully and luckily, it is the old people, especially the ones with comorbidities, who are facing high mortality, right? Then this one, end of the tunnel. Again, this is about the GST collections. We discussed yesterday, it was 1.05 lakh crore. Again, a word of caution. Now, everybody is an economist. See, the beauty of being an economist is that they are rarely right. Then to page 7, reinforcing RBI's accountability. It must abide by the law and appraise the center of why it failed to control inflation. So she's giving some figures as to how RBI has failed to control inflation, right? So those figures are not important. If you want, you can read it. But at this point, let us look at the concept of inflation targeting and what is an MPC, because this is in news regularly. So let us look at that. So it is a government constituted body, MPC, which is tasked with framing monetary policy using tools like repo rate, reverse repo rate, bank rate, cash reserve ratio, etc. Now these are all the tools for monetary policy. Someday we'll be discussing them in detail. Now this body has been instituted by Government of India under section 45ZB of RBI Act 1934. So under section 45ZB RBI Act. Now what are the functions? It is entrusted with the responsibility of deciding the different policy rates, including MSF, repo rate, reverse repo rate, liquidity adjustment facility. So these are again the tools. For example, repo rate is the rate at which the banks take loan from the RBI. Reverse repo rate is the rate at which RBI takes money from the bank, right? Then LAF is a short-term measure. So is the MSF. So one day we'll be discussing them in detail. If I start here, you'll be confused. Now about the composition of MPC, it has 6 members. Of the 6 members, Government of India will nominate 3 and the rest 3 will come from the RBI, including the RBI governor, who is the ex officio chairman. Now when I say ex officio, that means by virtue of office. So whatever the committee is, because of ex officio, RBI governor is its chairman. Same goes for the Vice President of India, who's the ex officio chairperson of the Rajya Sabha. That is his constitutional position. Now, interestingly, no government official will be nominated to the MPC. This is to ensure that the monetary policy is independent of the central government interference, right? This is a well-established practice followed throughout the world. See, there are two parts of a finance policy, right? One is the fiscal policy, which deals with raising revenues and imposing taxes. This is the domain of government, right? The next is the monetary policy. Monetary policy is about managing the level of liquidity in the market along with ensuring growth. Now, it has been established as a best practice around the world that this monetary policy should be handled by a central bank, which is an autonomous body and it is independent of the government control. Because whenever we've seen that government has been involved with the monetary policy heavily, it has led to problems like hyperinflation and monetization of deficit, and that also ultimately in worst case can lead to hyperinflation. Now the other three members would be from RBI. Number one, governor, already told you, ex officio chairman, then the deputy governor in charge of monetary policy and executive director of the RBI. Now the selection about the three from government side. So that will be a search cum selection committee under the cabinet secretary. Again, RBI governor is there, economic affairs secretary and three experts in the field of either economics or banking or finance or monetary policy as its member. So again, this search cum selection committee has 6 members, cabinet secretary, RBI governor, economic affairs secretary and 3 experts. Now, what is the term of members of the MPC? The members of MPC will be appointed for a period of 4 years and shall not be eligible for reappointment. How the decisions are made? Decisions are taken by majority vote, each member having a vote. Now, what is the governor's rule? Number 1, he is the ex officio chair. Number 2, he does not enjoy a veto power, that is power to overrule other panel members, but has a casting vote. Casting vote means that in case there is a tie between the votes, then he will cast his vote. Same is the power of Speaker of Lok Sabha. The Speaker of Lok Sabha does not vote in the first instance, but if there is a tie of votes, then that Speaker can cast a casting vote, which is a tiebreaker. Now, what is RBI monetary policy? This is a policy which pertains to deployment of monetary resources under its control for the purpose of GDP growth and lowering inflation rate. Reserve Bank of India Act 1934 empowers the RBI to make the monetary policy. Now again, what is inflation targeting? This involves using the monetary policy to keep inflation close to the agreed target. So earlier it was just the RBI who used to do that. Then in February 2015, an agreement was signed between the government and RBI for a monetary policy framework agreement. So as per the agreement, the objective of monetary policy framework would primarily be to maintain price stability, that is inflation targeting, while keeping in mind the objective of growth. According to the agreement, RBI would aim to contain consumer price inflation, that is CPI. I've explained what is CPI, and that is the main target or the measure through which Government of India measures inflation since 2014, right? Within 4% with a band of plus minus 2. So the inflation has to be managed within a band of 2% to 6%. But recently, the inflation has gone above 6% or very near to this. If RBI fails to do so for 2 consecutive quarters, then it would be answerable to MPC. It has to explain to MPC and ultimately to government that what led to the failure so that steps could be taken to correct it. So this is about MPC and inflation targeting. Then this one, the nutrition fallout of school closures. So this is basically about how COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem of child hunger and malnutrition. Because of the lockdowns, children could not go to school. Now for a majority of children, especially those belonging to vulnerable section in India, the midday meal scheme was a very good and important source for nutrition, and for some it was the only source of nutrition. But that has suffered because of this pandemic and lockdowns. So let us see what they are saying. So first they quote a report, The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2020, released by FAO in partnership with UNO. As of April 2020, the peak of school closures, 369 million children globally were losing out on school meals, and bulk of which were from India. We've already discussed the Global Hunger Index, right? So no need to talk about it again. A report by International Labour Organization and UNICEF on COVID-19 and child labour, again interesting. See, these are the things that you can quote. Unless school services and social security are universally strengthened, some children may not even return to schools when they reopen, especially those children belonging to vulnerable sections. Because of the lockdowns, not only is their education suffering, but their family incomes have also dropped. So they have also entered into the workforce as child labor. So it won't be easy for them to get out of this now. Now they are also telling us about midday meal scheme. So it is a sort of an introduction. Under the guidelines, every child should get 450 kilocalorie of energy, minimum of 12 grams of protein, and adequate quantities of micronutrients like iron, folic acid, vitamin A, etc. This is approximately 1/3 of the nutritional requirements of the child, with all school going children from class 1 to 8 in government and government aided schools being eligible. So this is a introduction to your midday meal schemes. Even if you know this much, you are safe, right? Many research reports and even the Joint Review Mission of MDM's 2015-16 noted that many children reach school on an empty stomach, making the school's midday meal a major source of nutrition for the children, particularly those from vulnerable communities. Now, central government issued orders in March and April. It announced that usual hot cooked midday meal or an equivalent food security allowance, dry ration, would be provided to all eligible school going children, even during vacation, but states were still struggling to implement this order. Now they're talking about some worrying points that as per the FCI, Food Corporation of India's data, less food grain has been off-taken for MDMS, that is midday meal scheme. So the offtake for grains for midday meal scheme has been less. That means less children are getting those grains. There are reports of children engaging in labor to supplement the fall in the family incomes in vulnerable households, like I told you, and they might not be able to return to education even after these lockdowns end and the pandemic ends or the school reopen. Now they are also talking about some innovative strategies that could be used to counter this. Number one, including local smallholder farmers in the school feeding program. Then they are also talking about new initiatives such as the school nutrition kitchen garden under the midday meal scheme to provide fresh vegetables to midday meals. So they could be taking those fresh vegetables. Then hot meals, that is the cooked meal, can be provided to eligible children with a plan to prepare and distribute the meal in the school midday meal center. There should also be adequate awareness about the availability of scheme, right, which is lacking right now. They are also talking about locally produced vegetables and fruits may be added to the midday meal scheme. So it will not only provide nutrition but also supplementary income to local farmers, some of whose children might be missing out on schools because of the lockdown and pandemic and because they had to enter labor force as child labor. So if they are getting income, that means those children would be able to come back to school. And distribution of eggs, an important source of protein and other micronutrients, can be carried out, but only where a state provision is already there, right? So states can go, if they are in line with the policy, they can also go for egg distribution. So this is all that they are telling in this article. Now this one, science versus Trump. So this is basically about the endorsement of Joe Biden by 3 science journals. Now Trump is stupid, we all know that, and he has a different take on science, right? But Joe Biden is equally stupid. If you must have heard his statements, you would be knowing what I'm talking about, right? Now leaving this aside, everybody is being prophetic and everybody is making their own, everybody is putting money on this election. We'll get to know on the 20th. And we'll get to see whether it goes to the courts or not. So let's not get into this. Then page 10, strategic partnership will aid smooth work in the event of regional crisis. So there's nothing much for me to explain here. You can please read it. This is basically a conversation with the Australian High Commissioner in India, right? And he's just making some points that this comprehensive strategic partnership, so it also includes artificial intelligence, 5G, rare earth products, especially in the field of rare earth products. Australia thinks that it can help India because the major supplier of rare earths in the world is China, right? And rare earths are very, very important for electronic industry. So every industry, every form of electronic industry needs rare earths like lithium, which is an integral part of the many batteries that we use. lithium ion batteries, and there are other rare earth metals, including precious metals like gold, that are used in the making of your electronic gadgets. So now that we are looking to cut supplies from China, so Australia says that it can help because Australia is very, very rich in natural resources, including rare earths, right? Now, countries like Japan, how are they facing that problem? They are basically going for massive recycling of old discarded electronics to get those rare metals. So we'll have to basically evolve different strategies. Now he's also talking about framework agreement on cyber and cyber enabled critical technology cooperation. It will enhance bilateral cooperation, provides a program of 66 crore over 4 years for an Australia-India cyber and critical technology partnership to support research by institutions in both Australia and between institutions in Australia and India. Now, special minerals and rare earth minerals, if you want to build batteries or electric cars, lithium among other metals is required. So they are saying they can help. Australia potentially sees an opportunity for us to provide elements into India's effort to improve manufacturing, defense and electric vehicles and energy mission projects. Now rest, nothing important, you can read. Also talking about space technologies and the quantum mission, which is about quantum computing and supercomputers. Then just the headline, government gets 6 weeks to file status report on Malia's extradition. Then state's suggestion sought to amend the IPC. So center is looking to amend the IPC. Now basically IPC tells the offenses which are under the Indian Penal Code or Indian law. Then there is also CRPC, which tells us about how to process or proceed with those offenses, how to try them, right? Now they made some amendment to criminal law in 2018 to prescribe more stringent penal provisions for convicts. The criminal law amendment 2018 provides, among many other provisions, the death penalty for rape or gang rape of a girl aged less than 12, no anticipatory bail for such crime, completion of investigation in 2 months and trials in 2 months. So this is sort of your important point for crimes against children, right? Now page 11, Traffic Corps of Space. So this is basically about space debris. A Canadian startup is making a space situational awareness system, which is akin to a GPS system that we have for navigation on ground. So this space situational awareness, it would be like a GPS for space debris. So interesting concept, and this is also telling us something about space debris. So let us look at it. Space has its own environmental problems, particularly a sharp increase of space debris. This Canadian company is attempting to solve this with the latest technologies. So Skylark would be the first dedicated satellite constellation looking at managing the situation in space, such as congestion, threats of collision, and addressing space traffic management. So the company is Northstar, which will be making that constellation. Northstar plans to provide safe and sustainable solutions through its Skylark satellite constellation, designed specifically for space situational awareness. Now, just the trivia, Sputnik 1 was the first human-made object to orbit the Earth. Its launch created new opportunities in space. However, 63 years later, it has also added 29,000 objects as debris larger than 10 centimeters in diameter, in addition to 2,500 plus active satellites. Just look here, expanding space environment. According to European Space Agency, the number of space debris objects in Earth's orbit is 6.7 lakh, which are larger than 1 centimeter, and over 17 crore larger than 1 millimeter. Mega constellations from companies such as SpaceX and Amazon will add thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. I will also be telling you what is low Earth orbit in just a moment. It presents a serious challenge to operators, regulators, insurance companies, and investors. Northstar plans to provide the information to prevent accidents as the number of satellites exponentially increase. Now, space environment. As space organizations around the globe explore opportunities in commercial space industry, artificial space objects are only expected to grow, and this is where the SSA comes in. SSA tracks natural and artificial objects in the orbit around the Earth and predicts where the objects are going to be at any time. So this is what is going to happen. They will be using a constellation like this, and then they will be predicting what would be the trajectory of this object and at any given time where it would be. So it would help manage any collision and also traffic and congestion in space, right? The constellation of 12 satellites would be equipped with optical sensors to monitor space objects, including active and inactive satellites and debris that could pose a threat. Now, most space junk can reach a speed of nearly 29,000 kilometers per hour. So, imagine if it falls on Earth. Because of the amount of debris in low Earth orbit and the speed at which they are moving, they move at around 7.8 kilometers per second. Current and future space-based services, explorations, and operations pose a safety risk to people and property in space and on Earth, according to NASA. The space-based satellite system has certain advantages over ground-based systems, including having multiple points of view for an object, not reliant on weather changes and atmospheric interferences, and the ability to make frequent revisits. So basically what happens right now, we have land-based antennas, yes, dishes, and they track these objects in space. Now it is dependent on their relative positioning, then the weather conditions and many other things. And then there is always a lag in the sending and reception of signal. So this is a much better and superior way because it is going to do the tracking in the space itself and send the signal to Earth. The system works on North Star's algorithms to provide space traffic data and collision avoidance navigation services, and the satellites are needed to get the data from the right perspective. Then North Star would offer subscription-based service which would be available to organizations to address their specific needs. The announcement is a step towards becoming a revenue generating enterprise. So very interesting concept of space debris and how this company North Star is going to handle that problem or is providing a solution through an SSA, space situation awareness system, which is like a GPS, but it is in space and for space objects which are moving in the low Earth orbit. Now at this point, let us look at what is low Earth orbit. So say any orbit which is less than 1000 kilometers is called a low Earth orbit. So it is normally at an altitude of less than 1000 kilometers, but could be as low as 160 kilometers above Earth, which is low compared to other orbits, but still very far above Earth's surface. By comparison, most commercial aeroplanes do not fly at altitudes much greater than approximately 14 kilometers. So you can imagine. Now low Earth orbit satellites do not always have to follow a particular path around the Earth. Their plane can be tilted. So that is the flexibility that you can change their path however you want. And that is why they are so popular among different companies and for different applications. This means there are more available routes for satellites in low Earth orbit, which is one of the main reasons why low Earth orbit is very commonly used orbit. Another reason is that you need less fuel, less powerful rockets to launch these satellites into that orbit. Low Earth orbit's close proximity to Earth makes it useful for several reasons. It is the orbit most commonly used for satellite imaging, of course, because it is nearer to the surface, so it will give higher resolution. Number two, it is used for the International Space Station as it is easier for astronauts to travel to and from it at a shorter distance. Now, satellites in this orbit travel at a speed of about 7.8 kilometers per second. However, individual LEO satellites are less useful for tasks such as telecommunications. So for that, we make a constellation of satellites in the low Earth orbit because they move so fast across the sky and therefore require a lot of effort to track from ground stations. Instead, communication satellites in low Earth orbit often work as part of a large combination of constellation of multiple satellites to give a constant coverage. In order to increase coverage, sometimes constellations consisting of several of the same or similar satellites are launched together to create a net around Earth. So if there's a question about constellations, so generally if you're talking about telecommunication satellite and if they're mentioning constellations, that means they are talking about low Earth orbit, right? This lets them cover large areas of Earth simultaneously by working together. So this is about your low Earth orbit and space debris and space situation awareness system. Now page 13, Gilgit-Baltistan to be a full province, Pak PM. So this buffoon, he did not mention a timeline. Again, this is just a diversionary move. We've already discussed in detail in yesterday's video why Pakistan is moving ahead to integrate Gilgit-Baltistan. Number one was a quid pro quo for India on India's move for Article 370, right? Number two was the local sentiment in Gilgit-Baltistan because they are predominantly Shia Muslims who have little ethnic identity or commonality with the rest of the POK. So they have always demanded to be integrated. And Gilgit-Baltistan is one of the regions which has a very high discontent against Mr. Imran Khan. So he thinks that by making it a province, he could assuage the people's discontent. Then the third was China factor. What were the parts in China factor? Number one, China has developed or built Karakoram highway through the Gilgit-Baltistan region, right? Which is a part of CPEC. Now that is a very, very important project. That CPEC is like a crowning jewel for the BRI initiative, and China has already invested about 40 to 60 billion in that project. So any change in status quo, because China has been riled after India's move on 370. So this problem could go further. So to basically future proof itself, China is pushing Pakistan so that once Gilgit-Baltistan is no longer a disputed territory but an integral part of Pakistan, China can have its run. Number two was the strategic location, because China is looking at opening a two-front scenario against India, one from Aksai Chin and the other from Gilgit-Baltistan. And the lure of opening this two-front against India would be good enough for Pakistan to accept Chinese troop presence in the region. And that is the third point, that China wants to put its troops in the region. And if it is an integral part of Pakistan, then there won't be that much international resistance to their presence there. And why did Pakistan did not do so till now? Because it wanted to keep the status in flux so that it could mount pressure on India that this is a disputed territory and there should be a plebiscite. But after India's move on 370, we have just sent a signal that for us, this issue is dead. And for all practical purposes, this is an integral part of India, right? So this is the background, and now this buffoon is trying to do so. Now at present, Pakistan has 4 provinces, but within 20 years, it would be just 3, because for sure, Balochistan would not be there if India ups the ante. It is all about India's intentions. If we take the risk, we can actually implement that. So Pakistan has 4 provinces. One is Punjab, then Sindh, right? Then Balochistan, and last is the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So those are the 4 provinces. So now Pakistan would need to have a constitutional amendment. If it is able to do that, then Gilgit-Baltistan will become the 5th province. Now regarding this name Pakistan, so this was suggested by Chaudhry Rahmat Ali in 1933. Now this name has some significance. So P stands for Punjab, right? A stands for Afghanistan, the northwest frontier province at that time. K is for Kashmir, I is for Sindh, and Tan is for Balochistan, right? The region that they would lose for sure, right? And he proposed this in 1933 in a pamphlet, Now or Never. So remember the name Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, 1933, pamphlet Now or Never, in which he suggested the name Pakistan, and this is what Pakistan stood for, right? And that is why they are fighting for Kashmir. Now really Kashmir's fight is not about Hindu-Muslim, it is about water, because many important streams they run from Kashmir, right? They are either originating in Kashmir or are running through the region. And if you look at the Indus River, that is the most essential river for Pakistan's survival. So if any problem were to happen, for example, Pakistan is scared because India is the upper riparian state. All the tributaries of Indus River system are flowing through India. So if India were to cut any of the flow, then Pakistan would be in a big problem. So that is the insecurity that they have, and that is why they want to control this region called Kashmir. It has nothing to do with Islam. These people are, what can I say about them, right? They don't have food to eat, but they would go out on the streets, and this person incited reaction against Macron, and now see what is happening in Pakistan. It is out of his control. That is what happens when this head of the state is a druggie. So this is also telling us about that only Karakoram highway and all that I've already discussed. Then this one, personality, Chennai born Priyanka, New Zealand's new minister. So this new cabinet of Jacinda Ardern is very diverse. It has people from multiple ethnicities, also from LGBT communities. So she's a very progressive person. Priyanka is part of the cabinet, Priyanka Radhakrishnan, right? Again, IS attack on Kabul. This is what they do. Snowden aims to become dual US-Russian citizen. Let us see if it happens. Then on Afghan highways, Taliban calls the shot. Now this is going to be a problem because as soon as US gets out, it would be Taliban calling the shots, and Taliban would be backed by Pakistan, and their ultimate father would be China. So this would be a very, very difficult situation for India. Then manufacturing grows fastest since 2007. So because of the resumed activity, manufacturing has been growing as per the PMI index, which rose to 56.8. If you remember, we have discussed already that it takes a survey from 500 companies, right, about what they feel the prospects. There are 5 categories from which they ask the question, and any score above 50 is growth, 50 is stable, and below 50 is your contraction, right? So this is the IHS Market PMI index, which showed a score of 56.8. And talking about confidence, so this confidence among the manufacturers is at a 50-month high. The level of confidence was at a 50-month high. They are very, very hopeful about the future prospects. So this is some good news for the economy. So let us look at this IHS PMI again. So it measures performance of manufacturing sector and is derived from a survey of 500 manufacturing companies. Now it is based on 5 individual indexes with the following weights: new orders, outputs, employment, suppliers delivery times, and stocks of items purchased, and it is released on a monthly basis, right? Now how to read? A reading above 50 indicates an expansion of the manufacturing sector compared to previous month. Below 50 represents a contraction, while 50 indicates no change. So based on this 58 point something, the reading for this month, so the government is saying that we are having green shoots in the economy. Then GST shortfall, center to transfer second tranche. So we have already discussed center would be taking loans and passing on tranches to the states, right? Now starting with the Indian Express, timing of Jagan letter suspect but no consent for contempt. We have already discussed. On table for next round of LAC talks, thinning of troops. So already 7 rounds of talks have taken place at the level of core commanders. Now next level is going to take place, and they are going to discuss about reducing the number of troops. But then again, we can't trust the Chinese. Now Modi Xi at 3 meetings. So in the coming days, Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping are set to meet each other at 3 virtual summits this month: the BRICS, SCO, and G20. Ahead of these meetings, the two sides will hope to dial down the tension somewhat. So let's see. Then delisting Kamal Nath, we've seen. First India-born minister in New Zealand, her father says proud, not surprised. So Priyanka Radhakrishnan, we've discussed about her. Then at Pride Metro Station, transgenders find welcoming workplace. So you can use this in paper 1 social issues. So DMRC has hired 6 transsexual people, right? Or transgender people. And this is just an example of how you can have diversity in hiring and how there should be greater acceptability for people having different lifestyles, alternative lifestyles and beliefs. Now this is an advertisement. I cannot vouch for its credibility. If you want to read it, go ahead and read it. This is by some private organization, Center for Environment and Agriculture. They have made some points dispelling some myths. So if you feel like reading it, going through it, do read it. They have made some interesting observations, but then again, I cannot verify the facts presented here unless until Government of India or some authorized body does not back it up, right? Then again, a small example for protests, environmental protests. So in Goa, people are protesting against new developments that are happening, basically new infrastructure projects. So let us see. So the Marmagua Port Trust's projections for 2030 say they want to import 51.6 million tons of coal for Adani Group, Jindal Steelworks Group and Vedanta. Much of this will be transported through Goa to other states. Also, Shipping Ministry has identified 17 coal-backed power plants and 22 steel plants as potential clients for the port. The protests are against infrastructure projects being designed to carry this coal that is expected to destroy ecological biodiversity. So it is very, very important, and it is the right thing that the residents are doing. Railway haven't got permission for laying tracks in the Western Ghats and has started laying them in the state, which is when the Goans protested. So let us hope railways, they take back their development project. Then just the headline: in Germany, Foreign Secretary raises LAC standoff terrorism. So our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Harshvardhan Shringla, he is visiting some European countries. So in Germany, he made these statements. Then this one about Charlie Hebdo. If you want to read, he sort of tried to blame them, right? But he gives some background as to emergence of comics. So this is not for your examination, just for enriching your knowledge. You can read this, but this has nothing to do with your examination. Then quad, we've done it so many times. This one is talking about RSS. Again, this is not for your examination. Then needed reinventing Nehru. So it is a shame that after so many years we are still stuck there. Useless thing. Then just for your PT, violin maestro T.N. Krishnan dies. Then this explained is all about elections in US. It is not going to help you in your examination. If you want to read, this is about the polling booths, till what time they'll be open. Is the fraud expected? We've discussed everything. So if you want to, you can read that. But nothing related to examination. Same goes for this Malabar exercise purpose participants. We've been discussing that so many times. So nothing new here for me to tell you. You can just read it. Then this keeps happening in Afghanistan. Again, this will be a problem for us in future. Then just a headline, customs duty need judicious use, has to be phased out slowly. So the finance secretary, Mr. Ajay Bhushan, he has made this statement that government will slowly phase out the hike in custom duties levied earlier for protection of domestic manufacturing. And the State Bank of India, it submitted its research report. So just this point I found useful for you guys. A closer look at the regression data of India's imports of raw materials, intermediate goods, capitals and consumer goods in the weighted average of import tariff. You can leave all of this. I am sure it does not make sense to you. Just this one. Even 1% increase in tariff, the imports declined by around $2 billion on an average. So that is the power of tariffs, that even if you increase the tariff are basically the taxes you levy on imports and exports. So to make our economy grow and to promote domestic manufacturers, what we would do, we would want to make the imports costlier. That is why people will buy the Indian made products. And as it is, there's a problem of perception in our country. We like everything foreign. So people have less of a pride of a thing when they buy made in India, but they have great pride in saying I bought a foreign thing, right? So that thing is also there. So to promote Indian industries, we'll be raising the tariffs and duties on the imports. So that is what it is telling, that even if you raise import tariff by 1%, there's a decline in imports by $2 billion. So that is the power. Rest you can leave, it won't even make sense to you. So folks, that is all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our channel. Also press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos. And please give us a thumbs up if you liked our videos. Also, connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. And please connect with us on our Telegram page where you can access the PDFs of the videos that I'll be posting daily, right? So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.